James works for Spotify, and he's a senior site reliability engineer, and he's currently focused on revamping Spotify's runtime infrastructure. Previously, James was the team lead of the Cloud Foundry build pack team at Pivotal and served as a contributor and maintainer of Bundler. James has previously spoken about build packs at Cloud Foundry Summit Europe and about Spotify's infrastructure journey and migration at QCon New York and several others. In his free time, he loves climbing on plastic and on rocks. And he's actually been to Chattanooga before to climb, as we were talking before the talk. So welcome, James.
Thanks. I'm James Wen, and from Spotify, I'll be talking about the DevOps culture of celebrating incidents. So what do I mean by celebrating incidents? So at Spotify, we try to see incidents as occurrences that are caused by processes, not people. We try to blame the process, not the person. And we try to treat each incident as a valuable learning opportunity and a chance to improve the related systems and processes. And so this talk will cover some of the more specific things that we're doing that play into this culture. We're not going to cover all the aspects of operations or on-call or incidents at Spotify because we only have 30 minutes, but we'll talk about some the key components of what we do there. So quick about me. I'm currently senior SRE at Spotify. I started out on a team that maintained the internal provisioning and internal DNS, with internal DNS being one of the most incident-heavy teams there is. And now I'm part of the same organization, core infrastructure, but on a different team, one that now maintains deployment and is responsible for our ongoing Kubernetes migration, with deployment still seeing a fair amount of incidents. So in terms of the agenda that we'll cover, I'll give a quick about Spotify and talk about how much scale we're dealing with. We'll talk about how we do operations to kind of see the context there. And then we'll talk about some of the specific things we're doing in terms of psychological safety and learning that plays into our incident culture. And then some takeaways at the end. So quick about Spotify. We're an audio streaming platform, and our mission is to give billions of fans the opportunity to enjoy and be inspired by 1 million creative artists. In doing so, we have a fair amount of users and subscribers and a fair amount of audio content on our platform. So these pretty large numbers are supported by a fairly large amount of engineers and teams. So we have about 1,500 plus engineers across 280 plus different teams, operating a very large amount of microservices that deal with a fair amount of load and a fair amount of data. So how do these 1,500 plus engineers, how do they do operations, or does operations occur at Spotify? So when companies start out, say in the stealth startup mode or something like that, they might operate with a complete team autonomy model for operations, where you have some feature developers focused on the product primarily, doing operations in a pretty ad hoc kind of way, like SSHing to servers, deploying stuff very manually. Spotify is interesting in that it did not start out that way. It started out from the very beginning with a centralized ops model. So as early as 2007, when there were just 7 feature developers for Spotify, there was already an ops engineer who was responsible for running Spotify and keeping it up and running. So that one ops engineer was basically the start of our centralized ops team, and that carried us all the way from 2007 to 2014, when we moved to a model called ops in teams. So with ops in teams, teams are building their own services, but they're also operating them as well. But they're doing this using pretty extensive tooling and the platform that we as the core infrastructure organization is providing for them. So they're doing operations with these tools, but they're doing it at a much higher abstraction level, thinking on the level of I want to do my deployments with canaries and not needing to really worry about implementing that canary logic or something like that. And a really great actualization of this at Spotify is something we call the golden path. If you've heard of the paved road at Netflix, similar model. And it's basically an opinionated, blessed best practices for building and operating services at Spotify. And part of this includes a pretty comprehensive tutorial that covers how to create a new backend service, put it into production, set up ops and like monitoring metrics, all that stuff for it that developers can basically go through on their very first day at Spotify to like put something into production. And so we kind of moved to the ops and teams model for a variety of reasons, with the most relevant reason for this talk being to eliminate the really stressful scenario where you might have engineers or ops people who are on call for services that they don't really work with on a day-to-day basis. Basically, potentially being woken up in the middle of the night for an alert for a service that they've never seen before. That's incredibly stressful, and it doesn't really scale that well when you have, in our case, a magnitude more feature developers than ops people or like SREs or infrastructure like focused people. So that's our operational model. Let's talk a little bit more about our culture around incidents. So part of what spurred on this talk is that we recently reached an internal milestone that we call Incident 10K. So that's not actually, like, as a caveat, hitting 10,000 incidents, but rather we have like this internal Jira board marked incident that covers all incidents internally and also like incident remediations. So how we think about this is that we reached 10,000 Jira tickets committed to visibility and tracking around incidents, and also improving things, making it better as a part of the overall incident process. And so this milestone was met with like custom stickers. I have some if anyone wants some after the talk. Celebrations, and also a really great internal blog post by one of our senior staff engineers. And the overall message of that blog post was that we view this not as like 10,000 times that we or an individual had failed, but rather 10,000 times that we've had a valuable learning opportunity to better like our knowledge, systems, and processes. So all that probably sounds great, but let's focus a little more now on like the more concrete things that we've done to kind of reinforce and establish this culture. So the first one would be in the realm of like psychological safety and desire. Basically, how do you make incidents not as high stress, or make the on-call process not as stressful or like a feared kind of thing? So basically what we try to do is make incidents not seem like some really unlucky or like destructive thing that can completely derail your whole day. And we try to make people desire to go on call, or at the very least like not mind it. So the first thing is onboarding. We have a pretty great onboarding process for going on call, and the main thing that it leans on is something called goaling. So what goaling is kind of a parallel shift to your on-call shift that occurs during business hours, where you would be kind of taking in all support requests, responding to them, maybe doing maintenance, talking with like third-party providers, that kind of thing. Basically taking on the interruptible work for the rest of your squad, or the rest of your team, so that they can focus on the sprint work. And so this is something that onboardees to a team basically do a few rotations of before they're expected to actually go on call. And it kind of serves as a really like super safe on-call mechanism. Basically, during business hours, while the rest of your team is working, they answer and investigate like a variety of like support requests relating to the various systems that your team might own. And they do this without the expectation that they have to do sprint work as well. Oh, I'm good, thanks. So this is pretty important because we also want to make the goalie process as least stressful as possible. And part of that is that while they're dealing with these various support requests, they shouldn't be pressured to kind of knock them out as fast as possible and get back to doing regular sprint work. They should basically have the flexibility and focus to respond to those with like their full effort and to dive as deep into them as possible. So like if a team is asking about a pretty custom use case, we don't want the goalie to basically want to just answer that with the bare minimum response. We want them to like, get deeper into the investigation and really help out the team. And so when someone is onboarding as part of the goalie, Again, they're doing it during business hours, so there's no possibility of them being paged in the middle of the night for an alert or anything like that. And they also, the team is understanding that the person is onboarding for this process, so they might ask questions about the systems that they don't know about, and they can get help there. The other aspect is mock incidents. So some teams will leverage this to not really for like the technical side of things to get familiar with technical systems, but more to improve and like practice with process around incidents and coordination and that kind of thing. So for example, at the end of a few mock incidents, you might not necessarily know like the deep technical internals of your systems, but you will know where to find like playbooks for them. You'll know what other teams kind of rely on your services and how to contact them. And an important part of this is also we try to teach people how to use our internal portals to like find out who owns the service and that kind of thing. Basically, at the end of this, it's not about the technical aspects. It's more about them knowing how to like coordinate and deal with incidents from like a process perspective. And so that's kind of the onboarding process. What about like the actual on-call process? So playbooks is something we leverage pretty heavily here and in a pretty specific way. So in general, a playbook is high-level instructions on how to respond to automated alerts. And so these playbooks can be the difference between a really stressful on-call experience and a really like smooth one. Our playbooks usually have 4 key sections. The first one being like the purpose of the alert that the playbook is associated with. What being the scenario that is probably occurring if the alert has fired. Troubleshooting steps so that they can basically figure out or determine if this actually is the issue. And then some mitigation steps. And for those latter 2, we try to make them as explicit as possible. So ideally, commands that they can copy and paste into their shell to run and like things about the expected output and all of that. Because we try to optimize for inconvenient response scenarios. And so what that means is that we're not optimizing for the case where at like right after lunch you're getting back and you get paged. We're optimizing for the case where you're getting woken up at 4 a.m., you're super groggy, you don't really know what's going on, and it might even be like an alert that you've never dealt with before. We optimize for that scenario. And so 2 of the things we do there in terms of optimization is we try to make the alerts super easy to find. So for all of our alerts, we try to make it so that you're not creating an alert without a playbook, for one thing. And then furthermore, for the thank you. For the PagerDuty alerts that are produced, we actually try to link the playbook inside the PagerDuty alert itself. So for that example alert that you see there, it also has like a direct link to the playbook under the links section. So this is the difference between like this scenario where you get woken up at 4 a.m., you have never dealt with an alert before, or the alert that you got paged for, and you don't even know whether there's a playbook that exists for it. So not only are you worrying about like troubleshooting and resolving the incident itself, you're also maybe going off on a little quest to find a playbook that may or may not exist for it. And the other thing is the playbooks should be really easy to digest. Again, you're potentially being woken up at like 3 or 4 a.m. To deal with an incident. You don't want to read like all historical context about the alert ever. You want to basically just read the bare minimum of what you need to know to like resolve it. And so I can speak from experience that I've had some really smooth incidents or like automated alerts, like dealing with them in the past, where I have gotten woken up, unfortunately, at like 3 or 4 a.m. and looked at my phone and saw a PagerDuty notification for an alert that I had never seen before. I recognized the system, I didn't recognize the alert. So what I would do was basically pull out my laptop, click through to the PagerDuty link, and then see, oh, there's a playbook. And I would basically thank my fellow team members in the past who have written that playbook pretty extensively, because it would result in me being able to go to sleep or resolve the incident within like an hour or so, half an hour even. So with good playbooks, who you have well onboarded engineers who are going on call with effective, like easy to find playbooks. This still doesn't necessarily mean that they want to be on call, just that they don't mind it as much. It's a less stressful occurrence for them. So some of the things that we do to make people want to be on call, I think the first one is maybe a controversial point, but we actually pay people to be on call, even though it is kind of an expectation that when you join a team, you will go on call for that team's services. You also get paid for the time that you're on call, like on a per-day basis. So what we've observed is that this goes a long way in basically making it much easier for things like getting coverage during holidays. For things like swapping shifts, people are a lot more likely to want to do that when they're getting paid for it, and it becomes a little less of a burden and more like a potential opportunity from that perspective. Another thing is to encourage on-call overrides after incidents. And this basically boils down to letting people take breathers after long or intense on-call incidents. We don't want to make it the case where someone just dealt with an incident at 2 a.m., maybe it was like 2 or 3 hours, and then they also have to get into work the next day. We're pretty open about basically take the day off, and also let someone else go on call for you, have someone swap shifts with you, or just take over that shift to get the rest that you need. And then the next 3 points are more from the technological side of things. So again, developers are doing their own operations with self-service technology and tools. So it's pretty important to give them as much power and abstraction as possible. For example, developers used to have to, a long time ago, provision servers via requesting machines via Jira tickets. So when that's your workflow for requesting machines, you're going to be pretty stressed during, say, the Christmas high load season when the process of getting servers is fairly slow. Nowadays, they can basically just run a single CLI command or press a button in our internal portal and get 100 machines or something like that. So that greatly reduces the amount of stress that they have while on call or while doing operations in general. The other thing is that we have a really nice central portal for operations and technical information. So this is pretty important because it allows developers to focus less on memorizing things like, oh, this team owns this or this team owns that. And they just need to learn how to find out that information, using the internal portal. So it basically reduces the operational or the cognitive overload of going on call for your services. And another pretty important thing is standardization. So as I mentioned, we have the golden path, the blessed set of practices or how to do things for your services. So with that, the vast majority of production backend services at Spotify look kind of the same. They use the same framework. They have metrics and ops and alerts set up kind of the same way. It makes it much easier for you to switch teams and also for you to take on call for a similar service that you might have never seen before. So for example, in Stockholm, where Spotify, the headquarters is based, there is a team called the backend GBG team, or org, I should say, that basically has a rotation of 30 different services. Their on-call shift involves ownership of 30 different services. And they're all kind of designed the same, so developers from that team have been able to respond to incidents or debug stuff for services that they've never actually worked on or shipped code for themselves because they know how the framework works, they know how the app works from an overall high-level perspective. So that's basically how you can potentially establish psychological safety and make on-call and incidents a lot less stressful. But the other aspect of the culture that we've been talking about is the actual learning and the celebration of incidents, how you can treat them as opportunities instead of burdens or negative things. So the main thing that we do in this area, I would say, is postmortems. And so a postmortem in general is just a post-incident reflection or analysis of the causes and the incident. And what we found here is that engineers really love to complain about things, and properly run postmortems can be a really great constructive time for the people or the engineers involved to complain as a group about the processes and systems in place that are like shared by the team and not like any one individual, and find improvements and like prevent future issues, that kind of thing. So one important thing that we have here is like a pre-existing template for postmortem reports and how to like actually facilitate and conduct postmortems. Because again, with ops and squads, you might have like feature developers who have never been part of an ops team, who have never held a postmortem of their own before. So when they are expected to hold a postmortem, they don't really know what to do necessarily. We kind of take that cognitive load away from them by providing a template. So this template usually covers incident summary. So basically like the high level what happened during the incident, the impact for a few different categories like impact on internal developers, impact on Spotify users, impact on like third-party providers, that kind of thing. The causes. So the root causes is probably the most important part of this, and it's pretty important to note that it should not be like someone did this. It should be there were these things like processes or systems in place that let this person do this or made it easy for this person to accidentally do this. The last two are like the immediate and suggested future remediations. Immediate being like, what did you do at like potentially like 3 a.m. or whatever when you were dealing with the incident to fix the immediate issue. And then suggested future remediations is where you kind of, as a team, think about what you could do to prevent, to mitigate the root cause and prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. And then there's also like a timeline, which is more the factual, like what happened at this time. So this is where things like blank or like George accidentally deleted the cluster or something like that. That's where that would go, not in the root cause. So another thing is to, this postmortem report should be written after the incident, possibly like way after the incident, not during the incident. During the incident, you don't want to have to be worrying about, oh, like what is going to go in the postmortem report. You want to worry more about just like, you know, investigating and fixing the incident. So personally, what I do here is I just like throw tidbits into like a notepad or Sublime Text or whatever. But some members at Spotify, they've actually seen really good success in like recording their screens or using like terminal session recorders during their incidents, so that they don't actually have to really worry about like taking notes and context switching like during the incident. They can basically, after the fact, just look at what they did in actuality. And that should definitely not be used ideally for like auditing or submission, because that adds a whole nother level of stress while you're like debugging the incidents. It should just be for like personal reflection later. Again, don't write postmortems during or right after the incidents. Take a breather after the incident. Write the postmortem report the next day. It definitely doesn't need to be like the incident occurred, we need the postmortem the next day or like immediately after kind of thing. And again, postmortems are not about personal blame. For the root cause, human error should never be listed as the root cause. It should be what things like processes, systems did we have in place that enabled this person to accidentally do that. And so a good example there is that, so I think some people laughed when I said deleted the cluster. So this actually happened twice. One of my colleagues deleted the cluster. That's not the root cause. The first time it happened, it's that he was able to accidentally like manually delete the cluster by just pressing the wrong button. And then the second time, it was that we didn't have the proper like Terraform plan checking. Again, not that he submitted the PR or something, that's in the timeline. The fact that we didn't have the proper like review build mechanisms in place is the actual root cause. And so that's kind of the internal side of incidents, but incidents can also be a really great way to externally teach things, to take the learnings that you got internally and publicly outreach to the rest of the community. So incident reports or incidents in general, they make a really great subject for like external blog posts, talks, that kind of thing. They often come across as very like humble and relatable, and it's always really interesting to read like different failure scenarios, especially when it didn't happen to you or it's not happening to you at the time. So some examples here, AWS had a recent like outage, not that recent, but a recent outage in US East 1. They provided a very explicit and detailed like postmortem on it. Same thing with like GCP and a few of their networking issues. And so what I wanted to highlight there is that for external providers, this is almost like a necessity to maintain like trust, transparency for your users and that kind of thing. Not only that you know in full detail what happened and what steps you're taking to prevent it from ever happening again, but that you're willing to kind of share that with your users so that they also know what happened. And the last one is one of my favorites, but it's about Monzo, which is a digital-only bank. Last year at KubeCon in Europe, I think it was, they basically had a really great keynote about some Kubernetes outages they had. So to reiterate, this is like a digital bank giving an open keynote about production outages that they had. So that definitely to me like makes them seem like a very transparent, trustworthy organization in my sense. Trustworthy from like a transparency kind of thing. And so we also practice this. What I mentioned about the cluster deletions, we actually got a KubeCon keynote out of it. So my colleague, David, the first time he accidentally deleted the cluster, it was due to manual reasons. And it caused us to move to Terraform to basically codify how we were setting up our Kubernetes clusters. And then the second time we deleted the clusters, it was because, again, there were some issues with how we were using Terraform. So in the process of these two incidents, we learned a lot, and we felt that it would be valuable to kind of share these learnings with the rest of the community, especially as more people start to use like Terraform for maintaining their clusters. And so that resulted in a pretty great KubeCon keynote, if you want to check that out. So that's how we try to like engage in learning and teaching around incidents. And in this process, we've gotten a few learnings or takeaways that I want to leave y'all with. The first is that try to make on-call less stressful and more desirable. Reduce like the psychological pain and stress of being on-call. This can result in like smoother incidents, and your devs will look a lot more favorably on the incident and on-call process in general. Again, blame the process and systems, not the people. It should never be, I just want to reiterate this again, it should never be a person doing something as the root cause. It should be what enabled or allowed this person to potentially accidentally do this thing. And the last is to turn incidents into learning opportunities. So again, incidents and on-call don't have to be a stressful, negative experience. They can be an opportunity. They can be really valuable and rewarding in terms of learning, but you have to take the steps to make it that way. So thanks for listening. If this culture resonates with you or you're interested in working at Spotify, we are hiring. And my email and social media is up there. And I'm always really happy to talk about like infrastructure, technology, processes, anything like that. So please reach out.
Good job.